You know the feeling. A bright ray of light peeking slightly through your bedroom window, beaming into your tightly closed eyes. The shining sun interrupts your long night's rest. You rise and stare out the window with a feeling of comfort and security, now free of the worries and stress of the night before. You live the coming hours with the daylight dispelling any and all fears kept deep in the back of your mind. The sun inevitably sets before you retire to sleep and do it all over again. Every day you take for granted the safety you are gifted by the light outside. Others know no such luxury. Here are 3 stories of traumatic events, all occurring in broad daylight. This is a story my grandfather passed down to my dad, and him to me. I can't verify exactly how much is true, but it's pretty dark regardless. Just a few blocks from my grandfather's house was one of the oldest cemeteries in town. This cemetery happened to be the final resting place of some of the older members of the family. My grandpa and his siblings would often take time to visit some of the old family sites and pay their respects. And call it a morbid tradition, but we've always been encouraged to do that in our family, even to this day. He remembers being blessed with some beautiful weather one day and decided to pass through, considering it a gift from those above. Vibrant blue skies, fluffy white clouds, and the sun shining high made it as good a day as ever. It was only a short hike from his house before he found himself at the rustic gates and proceeded through. The place was structured pretty simply. There was a main drive that wound around the area and let back out onto the same road as the entrance, kind of like a long drive-through if you kept straight. The woodland surrounding the cemetery was packed with dense forest, with no other roads breaking off from the main path. Only one way in and out. Compared to more modern cemeteries, the place was pretty small. He'd found himself about halfway to the back in a little under 15 minutes. His grandparents' headstones were located further in the back, tucked away closer into some woods, apparently at their personal request. While making arrangements years ago, they'd asked to be laid near those woods to remain closer to nature. During the walk, he'd randomly peeked over his shoulder to notice a figure in the distance. What looked to be a middle-aged woman in a white dress was following the path behind him. He chalked her up as just another visitor, even despite her odd choice of attire, and continued moving forward. Maybe 5 minutes later, he said he got that chilling feeling of being watched, and looked back at the woman again. Only this time, she stood noticeably closer than before, assuming they were walking at about the same pace. He noticed her head facing down at the ground as she trudged forward in the same direction as him. She was close enough now for him to even make out some irregular details in her appearance. Her white dress was ragged, frayed, and littered with spots of dirt. Her red hair was wild and unruly. He remembers being especially concerned by her sulky body language and the fact that she never looked up from the ground even once. He carried onward, more unsure now with every step. The road narrowed more and more until he eventually found his feet at the foot of his grandparents' grave. It was quieter than before now, deeper in, silent even. He knelt down and touched the headstone before closing his eyes and saying a short prayer when a faint sound caught his attention. He could hear these subtle sobs and moans coming from behind him. He peered back and, sure enough, it was the woman in the dress. She was only 100 feet or so away now. He hung his head down toward the gravestone one final time before shooting upright and taking off in a sprint. The only way back toward the entrance was that tight road, and he sure as hell wasn't fleeing into those woods to shake who or whatever this was. He'd have to come pretty close just to get by her, but he had no other option. He began bolting back in that general direction, with his eyes and head locked forward until his curiosity inevitably got the better of him. As he passed the woman, maybe less than 30 feet away now, he could finally make out her face. Tears streamed from her wide eyes, and she began weeping and wailing worse than ever before. He always mentioned that look of horror on her face being like nothing he'd quite seen from another person before. He never even bothered looking back until he reached the cemetery gate, and finally, she was nowhere to be seen. The image of the woman's face sat in his mind for days after, until he witnessed a gut-wrenching report on the nightly news. That same day the two crossed paths, groundskeepers discovered a woman's body in those woods behind the cemetery. Her cause of death was ruled a suicide. My grandfather was met with overbearing feelings of confusion, guilt, and shame. For weeks, he'd questioned whether he could have done something to prevent this person's demise. He said he never set foot in that place again, unless accompanied by friends or family. A little background. I'm an avid and experienced camper. Pitching a tent and roughing it in the woods for a weekend was my preferred hobby in the Colorado summer. Whether I was flying solo or tagging along a group of friends, no camping trip was complete without my furry friend Bingo. Bingo was my dog of 6 years. An energetic, curious, and loyal pup, Bingo was always more than happy to tag along for a weekend of fun and relaxation in the great outdoors. He loved hiking, chasing down rabbits or any other small vermin he could get his paws on, and ending the day curled up next to me by a fire. He was a good boy. We'd usually camp together in state parks, or somewhere well-regulated just for convenience sake. On other occasions, we'd go out to a dispersed campground, where plots are carved out for use, but not generally overseen or maintained by state rangers or organizations. You're essentially just in the woods, with your closest neighbor being hundreds of feet away, if anyone was even there at all. This was rarely our preferred option, as there's not typically any bathrooms or supply stores all the way out. But it did provide a different rush and feeling of freedom for an outdoorsman like myself. At the time, I'd admittedly been handling a lot. There'd been talks of me possibly losing my job, coupled with me navigating some family turmoil. On top of that, I'd recently just had a nasty breakup with a longtime girlfriend. Things weren't going that great. I needed some type of release badly, and a weekend out in the woods sounded like a remedy. I started reading up on a few new places to set up shop. One that caught my eye was a site seated at the side of a winding river with wide open spaces to sleep under the stars. Only 20 minutes out from the nearest town, the spot seemed more than adequate. Somewhere new I could escape to, accompanied by old Bingo, of course. When that week finally ended, I couldn't start packing supplies and tossing them into my truck any faster. With a tank of gas and my furry passenger by my side, we were ready to burn rubber out of town. The campsite looked great. Better, in fact, than I'd remembered from the pictures. Plenty of open space, flat land, and best of all, quiet. I couldn't care to be bothered with everything going on back home, so I figured it'd be best to just turn my phone off, toss it in the truck, and soak in the surroundings. When we'd finally gotten our setup made, it was silent bliss, just what the doctor ordered. The hours after were filled with lots of fetch and exploration to tire Bingo out by nightfall. After a hearty dinner and woodcutting, we laid back, looking up at the stars next to the fire. I remembered how small I felt in that moment underneath that vast black sky. The moon and stars shining down on us gave me a feeling of inner peace. Even if just for a night, everything was perfect. I'd gotten up early the next morning looking forward to check out the nearby river I'd read about. I could hear it running in the distance and wanted to see if I couldn't go catch a fish or two for lunch. I tied Bingo up and served him his breakfast before heading off. I was a bit taken aback at what I found. The river seemed to be raging that day. The water was still high, widening the gap further between the land opposite to me. I certainly wouldn't be catching anything until things calmed down. Turning around and heading back, I could see camp in the closing distance. In the short walk away from the river, something began feeling off. Like a wave of paranoia had just washed over me. I turned my back to camp once again, facing the roaring water. I could hear a voice quietly, but clearly mutter a single word over and over again. It wasn't a shout echoing through the woods or yelling through the noise of the bustling river. It sounded like it was right there, speaking directly to me. Bingo. I turned my head back toward camp frantically to see Bingo sat where I had left him, now with his ears perked up and staring intently over me. Again, it whispered, Bingo. Bingo started sprinting in the direction of the river, breaking off from the rope hooked to his collar. I helplessly tried to stop him as he bolted past me, straight toward the water. I chased after him screaming and began tearing up, trying to think of anything I could to stop him somehow. I ran as fast as I could until he slipped out of sight. I got to the edge of the river and screamed tirelessly for any sign of him. I scoured the area like a maniac for any sliver of hope before giving up. I'd felt like by the time I'd get back to camp to call for help, it'd be too late. I couldn't find anything. I notified a few rangers and campers nearby, but nothing came of their search. Not even a trace. I lost Bingo that day. The only real silver lining from the whole situation was that I got to keep his collar to remember him by. Rest easy, old friend. My uncle was a frequent runner in his younger years. He took part in his fair share of competitive events, but tended to keep running more of a hobby for the most part. With all his experience and stamina, he was always searching for new trials or paths to traverse in order to challenge himself. One morning, he'd mapped out a new path spanning a few miles from his house to see what it had in store. The path was essentially a long loop around the local city dump that would let out back in the direction of home. There was plenty of barren ground and visibility, nothing out of the ordinary. Seemed like a routine jog for him. A little over midway through his trek, he noticed less cars and passerbys, only catching an employee of the dump heading into work every now and then. He decided to take a breather when he felt the terrain getting increasingly more unstable under his feet. He turned around and began walking back when something caught his attention deep into the surrounding brush. It was difficult for him to make out clearly at first, but after a few seconds it seemed to resonate with him. It was a white humanoid object sprawled out on the ground. A mannequin, and dressed to boot. That's odd, he thought. What's it doing this far from the dump? The harsh reality dawned on him as he moved closer and closer. This was no mannequin at all. This body was human. He'd initially convinced himself otherwise, because the head was perfectly clean-shaven. The most gruesome detail was the face. All the skin was indistinguishable from that of a typical human being. No eyes, nose, or mouth. Almost like they'd all just melted together into a featureless mess. He immediately contacted the authorities, who held him for a few hours of intense questioning. After concluding that he had no meaningful connection to the case, they let him go, but not before urging him to keep everything on the down low. And after that it was crickets. He never received any follow-up information from the authorities involved, no developments on the local news, and found nothing after probing the internet and social media. The whole thing seemed a little fishy, but he wasn't eager to go meddling in any of that business. Wrong place, wrong time, I guess.